The air in the vast reception hall of the Sterling mansion was as thick as the velvet draperies covering the windows, and it reeked of a suffocating blend of fresh pine and oriental lilies, flowers too expensive for real grief, but perfectly suited for the ostentatious display of tragedy. David, barely 14 but possessing a maturity forged by years of silence and sharp observation, breathed in the smell of incense and wealth, like it was poison. The boy stood near the doorframe, a place he knew was his, the invisible boundary between the staff and the elite guests. His worn sneakers, dusted with the soil from the gardens where his father served as the head gardener, were a stark contrast to the gleaming leather shoes, moving silently across the polished marble. David had neither a dark jacket nor formal shoes. He wore only a faded flannel shirt and the cold, unshakable certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. Despite the Sterling family and the rest of high society believing that the death of Jennifer Sterling, the 15-year-old heiress, had been a sudden and irreversible fatality, David felt in his gut that it was a lie. Not an intentional lie, but the lie of protocol, of rushed acceptance, of a lack of true attention. He knew Jennifer, not the version featured on magazine covers, but the girl who escaped to the garden's greenhouse where he worked alongside his father to giggle at her grandmother's pompous accents. He recalled an afternoon, merely 9 months ago, when she dared him to climb the tallest pine tree on the estate. Gasping and covered in sap at the top, she confessed her only true fear, claustrophobia. "David," she'd whispered, her light brown hair falling into her eyes, "I couldn't stand a small dark place, not even for a minute." Now, she lay in a delicate, small white casket, a piece of luxury funerary design that looked like it belonged in a high-end display, the exact type of confinement that terrified her. The white mahogany casket, lined with ivory silk, rested on a catafalque covered in even more flowers. The soft artificial light from crystal chandeliers cast a pale, deceptive glow on her face. Jennifer was dressed in one of her most formal school uniforms, a ruby brooch she despised pinned to the jacket. Her hands were crossed over her chest, clutching a single white camellia, a flower that would wilt before morning. The formality was a layer of ice over the sorrow, and David felt suffocated. He began to move step by step, ignoring the heavy-set security guard near the door and the row of family lawyers who looked ready to litigate even against grief itself. No one dared stop him. Perhaps they thought he was some distant relative, a lost soul in the vastness of the hall, or perhaps more likely they simply didn't see him. He was the gardener's son, a shadow in the tapestry of wealth. This invisibility was usually his protection, but today it was a burden. With every step on the cold marble, he could feel the room's pressure crushing him, but the image of Jennifer enclosed propelled him forward. He drew close, so close he could distinguish the pale blue veins on her closed eyelids. Most guests had their backs to him, huddled in small groups whispering about the inheritance or the company's future. Jennifer's mother, Elizabeth Sterling, knelt a few feet from the casket, her pain encapsulated in a flawlessly cut black Chanel dress. She wasn't weeping openly. Mrs. Sterling's mourning was elegant, a controlled performance. David looked at her, and his stomach clenched with the injustice of the situation. He leaned over, ignoring the smell of expensive candle wax and the silent tears of his own fear. He fixed his gaze on Jennifer's chest. The silence was so complete, he could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning system. In a desperate effort, he tried to find any movement, any sign of life. A slight shift in the ivory silk, a tremor at the corner of her mouth, the smallest expansion of her ribcage. Nothing. But his memory stirred. He recalled the last time he saw her, 3 days ago, when she dared him to plant a rare night orchid. "It only blooms when everyone is asleep, David," she had said, "and I'll be there to see it. Promise you will be too." She wouldn't be there anymore if he didn't do something. Suddenly a small detail, a dewdrop or perhaps an old tear had dried on the side of the casket, but near where Jennifer's hand lay, David noticed something different. The white camellia was slightly, almost microscopically, wilted on one of its side petals, as if a minimal heat source was affecting it. If she were completely cold, the flower would be crystallized by the ice of death, but the tip looked cooked. Minimal heat, imperceptible to the medical sophistication that had declared her dead, but evident to the gardener's son who understood botany. He straightened up, feeling the blood rush through his veins, panic and courage mixing into an explosive cocktail. His throat was tight, dry from the garden dust and social fear. The security guard, Thomas, who always treated him with polished condescension, noticed his movement. He stepped forward with the intention of discreetly removing him, but David was quicker. He took a step forward, his voice rough and untrained, slicing through the room's murmur like a shard of glass. "Stop!" The sound was too loud, too raw for the setting. The priest, reading a Latin text, stopped, the parchment trembling in his hands. Elizabeth Sterling lifted her head, her swollen eyes meeting David's. Not with anger, but with an icy confusion. "She's not cold," David managed to say, his voice cracking on the last syllable. The camellia is wilting. That doesn't happen in the cold of death. She's not dead." Thomas, the guard, grabbed David's arm with brutal force. "Back away, boy. Show respect. You are desecrating the family's grief." David struggled, but the strength of a 40-year-old man was overwhelming. He looked desperately at Elizabeth Sterling, whom he barely knew, whom he feared. "Mrs. Sterling, I know her. She's terrified of confined spaces, and she's generating heat. She's not—" "I felt it. I saw the flower." The priest cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Boy." The doctors examined Jennifer. Dr. Reed, one of the best specialists in the country, signed the death certificate almost 24 hours ago. David stopped fighting, but his gaze burned, piercing Thomas's indifference. The doctors looked for the end, not the beginning. They looked for the cold, but if they had looked for minimal heat, they would have found it. He knew it was a ridiculous theory, but it was the only weapon he had. He remembered Jennifer saying that his father's intuition about the weather was more accurate than any app. He was using that same intuition. Life sometimes hides, and the heat was its hiding place. Elizabeth Sterling finally stood up, but not to comfort David or to reprimand him. She rose like a statue, her look of disgust barely concealed, not at what he was saying, but at the scandal he was creating. Image was everything. David was a stain, a living reminder of the mess that real life created amid her controlled tragedy. He knew that if he didn't prove his claim now, he would be expelled and Jennifer would be sealed away. "Mrs. Sterling," David whispered, the last drop of energy in his voice, "I know what it's like to care for something that seems dead and discover there's still life in it. Touch her hand. Please. The heat of a life that's barely holding on doesn't lie. I promise you." The silence in the room was almost unbearable. The guests watched the scene, shocked by the boy's audacity. Elizabeth Sterling looked at David, the gardener's son, and for the first time she didn't see hierarchy. She saw only raw desperation, the same despair she was hiding beneath her own grief. It was an immense risk to her credibility, but the doubt, the tiny seed of doubt David had planted with the mention of the camellia, began to grow in her chest. If he was wrong, she would make him pay. But if he was right, she took a small step toward the casket, the most significant move she would make that day, but her expression remained impenetrable. With the eyes of all present, the elite of Seattle, fixed on her, Elizabeth Sterling moved. Her expensive shoes, which should never touch dirt, scuffed the polished marble. She hesitated, her black silk-gloved hand hovering over the white casket. The idea that she, a woman known for her calculated coldness, was considering the word of David, the gardener's son, was a social absurdity, a crack in her armor of grief. Dr. Reed, a man in his 60s with a face furrowed by medical self-assurance, quickly stepped forward, whispering urgently, "Mrs. Sterling, don't pay attention to the boy. It's hysteria, a case of projected grief. He needs to be removed immediately." Thomas, the security guard, pulled David by the arm, but the boy resisted with unexpected strength, his thin body trembling. Elizabeth ignored the doctor and the guard. What paralyzed her was not the fear of humiliation, but the fear that David was right. If he was, it meant she had failed in her vigilance, that she had accepted her only daughter's death with hurried protocol. That thought, of burying Jennifer alive, was a terror far greater than any scandal. She inhaled deeply, the smell of incense becoming unbearable, and took the final step. Her fingers grazed the side of the casket, and then she slid her hand, pulling off her silk glove with a hasty movement, and touched Jennifer's pale forearm. The reaction was immediate yet silent. She was not cold. There was no glacial stiffness, no marble temperature of death she expected and had been prepared for. There was a residual warmth, subtle, Yes, but definitely present. A warmth that science had dismissed as residual body heat, but which, under a mother's hand, felt like something different. A hesitation. A life that had not entirely yielded. The shock paralyzed her breathing. Her eyes widened, fixed on her daughter's face, searching for proof that her mind was playing a cruel trick on her. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice a rough sliver of disbelief. Dr. Reed, still convinced of his precision, took Jennifer's pulse with an air of superiority. "It's residual, Mom. Body temperature can take time to equalize with the environment. There is no pulse, no reflex. It's the end." But as he spoke, Elizabeth moved her hand to Jennifer's cheek, and there, under the pressure of her thumb, she saw it. Not a large movement, but a minuscule tremor in her facial muscles, almost a nervous tick, a contraction that was not the absolute stillness of passing. The cry didn't come from Elizabeth, but from David. The security guard Thomas had released him, shocked by his employer's hesitation. "Her chest!" David pointed, his eyes streaming with tears and hope. "Look at her chest. It's moving." And it was true. Beneath the white silk, a faint, almost imperceptible, but real movement lifted the fabric for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a normal breath, but an attempt to breathe, a spasm of a lung struggling to inflate. The room erupted into controlled chaos, the roar of high society in shock. The priest dropped his book. One of the lawyers dropped his leather briefcase. "Call an ambulance, now!" Elizabeth shouted, her composure shattered. Pain and grief were replaced by adrenaline. Dr. Reed, his face white as snow, felt Jennifer's neck. "Weak pulse, my God, she has a pulse. Suspended animation and cataplexy, perhaps. This is impossible." The scene shifted from a funeral to an improvised emergency room. Dr. Reed, who had been calm a minute ago, now acted frantically, trying to reverse the situation he himself had declared final. He snatched a stethoscope and pressed it against Jennifer's chest. Silence returned to the room, heavier than before, as everyone awaited confirmation. The doctor staggered back. "Heartbeat. It's slow, very slow, but it is there." At that moment, David burst through the adults and rushed to the edge of the casket, his hand meeting Jennifer's. He no longer cared about hierarchy or protocol. He grasped her fingers, his thin hand enveloping hers, and felt the warmth intensify. He whispered, his voice choked, "I'm here, Jennifer. You said I should look for you. I'm here." Reed's fury, the doctors, turned on David. Shock and professional humiliation made him irrational. "What did you do to her, boy? You touched her earlier. Did you give her something? Answer me," he snarled, gripping David's shoulder tightly. The idea of a poor boy exposing his medical error was unbearable. Elizabeth Sterling, who had been kneeling by the casket, raised her head. Her face was covered in tears, but her eyes, for the first time, had a crystal-clear focus. She shoved the doctor away from David with surprising force. "Let him go," she yelled. "Can't you see he saved her? If he hadn't spoken up, if he hadn't insisted, I would have buried her alive. All of you would have buried her alive." The accusation hung in the air, devastating, hitting all the attendees who had accepted the medical verdict without question. The arrival of the emergency sirens, now audible, broke the last shred of order. The room filled with paramedics, wearing bright uniforms that were incongruous with the mansion's pallor. They lifted Jennifer onto a stretcher, connecting her to a heart monitor, whose faint but constant beep, beep, beep sounded like the most precious melody in the world to David and Elizabeth. The gardener's son had kept his promise. He had found life. But the miracle created a new kind of fear. David, as he watched Jennifer being moved with the urgency of life, noticed that the look of some guests had changed. It was no longer disdain, but something more dangerous. Anger. The anger of humiliation. The anger that a secret had been exposed by an unexpected and irrelevant source. One of the men in suits, a high-ranking Sterling Company shareholder, approached Dr. Reed and whispered, his eyes fixed on David, "This cannot get out. It's a public relations nightmare. No one can know that science failed and that a gardener corrected the mistake." David heard it. He was only 14, but he perfectly understood the implication. The truth was less important than reputation. They would try to erase his intervention, turn it into a legend, or worse, a hysterical invention. His mother, the housekeeper, appeared at the door, pale, her face torn between pride and panic. "What have you done, my son? You confronted the boss." David, amidst the confusion, looked directly at the shareholder. He remembered the last lesson Jennifer had taught him. If you have the truth, don't lower it, make it shout. He didn't shout, but his voice came out with chilling clarity. If you try to cover this up, he said, addressing the shareholder, Dr. Reed, and Elizabeth herself, if you lie about what happened, the life she gained might be lost again. Her truth is her protection. Elizabeth looked at the shareholder and the doctor. She saw the fear in their eyes. But looking at David, she saw the courage she lacked. He had given her back her daughter. The debt was not financial, but of the soul. He is right, she said, her voice firm and full of authority. The new authority of a mother who had been reborn along with her daughter. The world will know, not for the scandal, but for the miracle. And David, she turned to the boy, you come with us. You are the proof that she fought. She invited the gardener's son to ride in the ambulance. It was an unthinkable gesture, a radical break with years of hierarchy. David, exhausted but with his heart pounding, just nodded. As he left the luxurious mansion, following his friend's stretcher, he knew life would never be the same again, neither for Jennifer nor for him. The truth had opened a door. If this turn in the story moved you, if you felt David's tension and Elizabeth's redemption, show your support. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this saga and other stories that prove the heart often sees what eyes and science ignore. And you, the viewer, at what point in your life did you have to challenge an authority or an established truth because of an intuition that no one else understood? Tell us in the comments. We want to read the stories of courage that are born in silence. The ambulance siren tore through the early morning, staining the imposing gate of the Sterling mansion with an intermittent red, a violent contrast to the formal paleness of the architecture. David sat in the back of the ambulance, next to the stretcher where Jennifer lay, monitored by equipment emitting constant reassuring beeps. On the other side of the stretcher, Elizabeth Sterling held her daughter's hand, her eyes fixed on the monitor, unconcerned about the proximity of David, the boy she barely acknowledged as a person before that night. The invisible line dividing their worlds had not just been broken, it had been incinerated by the urgency of life. At the hospital, the chaos of the emergency room swallowed Jennifer. David and Elizabeth waited in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Dr. Reed and the other family doctors arrived shortly after, pale and tense, trying to salvage what was left of their reputation. They discussed in low tones, mentioning atypical Cotard's syndrome, suspended animation, and severe cataleptic disorder, but never the word that hung in the air: mistake. David hadn't slept. He clung to the wilted camellia, the only object he had brought from the mansion. The florist, the gardener's son. The flower was his silent witness that the truth at times only reveals itself to those willing to look beyond the surface. David's mother, Maria, arrived, brought by his father, the gardener, who, worried, tried to pull his son away, fearing reprisals. "Let's go, David," his mother whispered, her hand trembling on the boy's shoulder. "We can't stay. They'll think we're asking for something." Elizabeth, who had been standing, turned around. She looked at the housekeeper, whom she usually just called Maria and with whom she had never had a real conversation, and then at David. Her eyes were red with exhaustion, but held a new depth, like someone who had glimpsed hell. "He stays," Elizabeth said, her voice hoarse but with unquestionable authority. "He is not asking for anything. He has already given us everything. Her life." She placed her hand on David's arm, a gesture worth more than 1,000 years of salary. "Your son is the reason my daughter is alive, Maria. I will never forget that." For the first time in years, Maria, the housekeeper, held her chin up. Fear gave way to restrained pride. Hours later, morning arrived, cold and grey. The sun tried to penetrate the hospital windows. The chief physician of the hospital, not Dr. Reed, but a neurology specialist named Dr. Patel, emerged from the treatment room, exhausted, but with a cautious smile. "She is stable," he announced. It wasn't a miracle, but a form of extremely rare and nearly impossible to diagnose catatonic coma. She had minimal vital functions, just enough to fool any routine examination. If they had delayed moving her by another 40 minutes, she would not have survived. Elizabeth's eyes met David's. 40 minutes, the difference between life and burial. Dr. Patel continued, "The most extraordinary thing is that she reacted to a stimulus. When we moved her, she started having spasms and even spoke a word, the name David. David felt his face burn with shyness, but also with profound victory. The connection they shared, based on secrets and escapes in the garden, was real. The resolution was not magical but deeply human. Elizabeth Sterling, in a moment of forced reflection, understood that money and power had blinded everyone, including herself, to the truth that was only accessible through simplicity. The social injustice that had always separated David from Jennifer was now the bridge that united them. She approached David, who still held the withered flower. "Thank you," she said. "You are not the gardener's son. You are my daughter's savior. I commit to ensuring that your life from today on is treated with the respect and value you demonstrated. You taught us what attention is and what abandonment is." David, speechless, simply nodded. Jennifer's mother, the distant matriarch, finally demonstrated forgiveness, not by apologizing but by offering a new beginning. She ensured that his intervention was documented, not as a scandal, but as a testament to human intuition, forcing the doctors and the press to acknowledge the truth, despite its strangeness. Jennifer recovered slowly. When David visited her a few days later, she was weak, but her eyes were open. He placed the withered camellia, now dry and fragile, beside her pillow. "You came," she whispered, her voice still faint. "I promised," David replied, smiling. The lesson was clear. True courage did not come from wealth or status, but from the refusal to accept the world's narrative when the heart said otherwise. David's power lay in his ability to see what was hidden, a skill honed by years of invisibility. If this story of courage, which transcended social class barriers to save a life, resonated with you, we'd like to invite you to be part of our community. Subscribe now. Stories like this that remind us of the true value of empathy and intuition continue to be told only because of your warm support. Share in the comments which city or country you are watching our stories from. Did you like the video? And what is the biggest lesson you learned from David's simple yet profound act of faith? We look forward to hearing your reflections.